All right, welcome to Chapter 8, Microbiology. We're going to divide microbiology into three different parts, and today we're going to start with just an overall introduction to microbiology. Throughout microbiology, we're going to cover all of Chapter 8, and at the end of this unit, we'll move on to Chapter 9, which is going to be toxicology. So just in this first part, we're going to define key terms of the chapter, and we're going to classify the different organisms, such as virus, bacteria, fungus, and parasites, and just look at basic characteristics of each of those. So let's start with microorganisms in general. A microorganism is any small microscopic entity that's capable of carrying on a living process. It's the study of all microorganisms, so that could include bacteria, fungus, protozoans such as parasites, and viruses. The human body does have something called normal flora. We have bacteria all over our body. These are the microorganisms that inhabit the body that do not cause harm. They can actually be very beneficial, and they can help fight off some of the bad bacteria. So the normal flora, like I said, assists in the colonization of pathogens. We do want to have a certain amount of normal flora, and we do want to make sure that the pathogens stay away. Here's an example. Lactobacillus is normal in the female vaginal tract. It creates a very acidic environment and in general keeps out a lot of pathogens. You can see this is a normal bacterial smear or a smear of a vaginal specimen, and these bacteria are normal. They help keep the environment healthy. But there are certain antibiotics that can destroy lactobacillus, and when that happens, things like yeast can overgrow. So a lot of women that have been on antibiotics find that they have issues with yeast overgrowth. This is a normal phenomenon that can happen, and it can be a little bit undesirable for the female, but when you kill off all of the normal flora, something like yeast or Candida albicans, as shown in this bottom picture, can take over. What's really interesting is that only 10% of all bacteria is pathogenic. The other 90% is either not harmful or is actually colonized in our body. So let's talk about these pathogens. Pathogens are the organisms that can cause disease. Only a small percentage of those organisms are pathogenic or can actually cause disease. A person's immunity plays a very large role. And while I'm recording this, COVID-19 is huge, okay? So we're finding that people that have a stronger immune system may be able to handle that pathogen better than people with a weaker immune system. When we work with these organisms, we have to use something called aseptic techniques. We do this for a lot of things. We use it when we're working with the bacteria to make sure we don't contaminate things. We also use it when we're working with patients to help stop the spread of those pathogens from person to person. We wash our hands, we use hand sanitizer, we wear gloves, anything we can do to prevent the spread of those. So let's look at the first classification. This is viruses. Viruses are molecular organisms that consist of something called RNA or DNA. So they really can't multiply or do anything on their own. They require a host cell in order to replicate. Here's an example on the right. This is HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. The virus is able to dock itself on the side of a T4 helper cell in a human body. What that virus does is it actually pushes its genetic material, as you can see right here. It's pushing that genetic material into that cell. It then uses the genetic material inside of that host cell to create more viruses. Once that cell becomes inundated with many, many virus copies on the inside, it'll burst, and all of those viruses will then be left out to the human body to infect more cells. The reason why this is so difficult to treat is because your body recognizes these cells as your own, right? It doesn't know that there's viral replication going on the inside in most cases. So it's really difficult for your body to fight off its own cells when there's something going on inside of it. The next one is bacteria. These are classified as prokaryotes because they have a cell wall and a cell membrane, but usually don't have a visible nucleus. We don't see the nucleus in bacteria. They're single-celled organisms and they reproduce by binary fission, which is asexual reproduction that involves the splitting of the cell in half. It can reproduce very rapidly because of that, and it forms colonies of millions of the same bacteria when we put them on nutrient agar for growth. We're going to use a lot of this agar in the lab over the next few weeks, and I think you're going to have a lot of fun watching this bacteria grow. We'll be growing bacteria from inside our mouths, and we're going to be growing bacteria from their environment as well. The next classification is fungi or fungus. This can be grown on media, okay, just like we're going to use for bacteria, but it uses a very specific media that requires specific nutrients. These are eukaryotic. They do have a nucleus and they have a nuclear membrane. They don't have chlorophyll like plants do, and usually we call these molds or yeasts. When we talked about the yeast in the first slide, we were talking about Candida albicans, but there's also mold in this classification. Everybody has seen mold on their bread or their cheese in their fridge, right? So that's where those would fall. Some of those can get us sick and some of them can actually make us healthy, right? So these are single cells. They reproduce by budding. Okay, so they have a new cell that forms on the surface of the yeast. It grows, it pinches off and becomes a separate cell. We can also see these as colonies on media as well, or on culture media, and we may actually see some of this in the lab as well. The molds that we can get from fungus are made up of mycelium. This consists of a tube-like structure called hyphae, so they actually grow and they look like little plants under the microscope. You can see some examples over here. Okay, so it has a stalk and we can see the yeast sometimes coming off of the top of those. Okay, a common non-pathogenic mold is found on stale bread that we mentioned. But when you look at those molds under the microscopes, they look very pretty. Next we have parasites. These are protozoa and worms. We can identify these microscopically, and they live on or in a host, and they derive nourishment from the host. You can see here a worm has actually traveled underneath the skin of this human. Now, this one's called Ankylostoma brasiliense, and I've actually seen this. I saw a student come back from spring break one time, and they're like, oh, look at this worm that I have. So you could actually see where the worm has traveled underneath the skin, and they actually got it from laying on the beach during spring break. Another one here is parasites. Parasites can be one-celled protozoa, such as Trichomonas seen here. Giardia is another cell that can cause intestinal bacteria. A lot of times these have things like flagella. You can see this one right here has a little tail that whips it around and allows it to be mobile. This one right here is known as Trichomonas vaginalis. It's a sexually transmitted infection that we can see under the microscope, and he's usually quite animated, as you can see here. There's other organisms such as helminths or worms that we saw before. There's tapeworms, roundworms, flukes, pinworm. We'll get into more detail on those in an upcoming chapter as far as the different types you need to be familiar with. Then we have lice, Pediculus humanus and Pterus pubis, such as crabs. So as the microscope life forms become more complex, the microbiologist sees two parasites. We can see the head louse, which lays the eggs. We call those nits. And there's also a microscopic pubic crab louse. You can see the difference here. This is called a prokaryote or before a nucleus. But we've got the head louse. You can see here in the pubic louse, they look quite different. So look in your microscope, we'd be able to tell which is which. Whenever we see a bacteria or the name written down of a bacteria, we look at the genus and species. Carl von Linné was a Swedish botanist who created this nomenclature system. It's a binomial system where the genus is capitalized and the species is not. The genus and species are always underlined or italicized, and the first initial of the genus may be used, followed by the whole species name, such as S. aureus instead of Staphylococcus aureus. And because of the font that's used in this slide, you'll see aureus is not lowercase, but it would be. Bacteria are classified and identified based on their shapes and growing patterns. You can see the shapes here. We have cocci. Cocci are coccus or spears. Coccus has a lot of O's and a lot of C's, and the letters actually in cocci look like circles, right? So that is the circular pattern. Bacillus or bacilli are very long. okay? And I see a lot of L's in the word bacillus, which are long. So that's kind of how you can differentiate those. In spirillus, those are spirals, as you can see here. So let's see, we can see some cocci in pairs. Those are diplococci. Some are in chains. We can call streptococci are found in chains. And we can see clusters. Staphylococci is found in clusters. When we look at these under the microscope, we're going to stain them. Gram-positive organisms turn purple, as you can see on the left, and gram-negative turn pink. And there are certain organisms that turn different colors, so we're able to tell the doctor right away whether we have gram-positive or gram-negative organisms, which will help them treat the patient. One of these bacteria is Staphylococcus. We have two of them that we'll look at. Staph epidermidis, which is normally found on the surface of the skin and the mucous membrane of the mouth, and Staph aureus, which can cause pathogenic conditions such as boils, carbuncles, pimples, impetigo, abscess, wound infections, and even food poisoning. Streptococci is one you're probably familiar with. These are cocci that are arranged in chains. Some strep are part of normal flora, and strep pyogenes can cause pathogenic conditions such as strep throat, scarlet fever, and rheumatic fever. This is severe strep throat right here. Streptococcus can also cause carbuncles, impetigo, pneumonia, puerperal sepsis, infection after childbirth, erysipelas, which is the flesh-eating bacteria you can see on this arm down here. Then we have that bacilli, okay? Bacillus is one, bacilli is plural. These are rod-shaped, and they can be described even as a coccobacillus, which is kind of like a cocci bacilli, or a diplobacillus, which is where they're in pairs. Some of the diseases we see with bacilli are urinary tract infections from E. coli, botulism, tetanus, gangrene, gastroenteritis, typhoid fever, pertussis, bacillary dysentery, diphtheria, tuberculosis, leprosy, and plague. Some pretty serious things come out of those bacilli. And a fun fact is that E. coli is the most common cause of a UTI, which we covered in our urinalysis chapters. And the other one we'll look at here is spirillum. Plural is spirilla. A spiral-shaped microorganism. Some that we think of are Treponema pallidum that causes syphilis, Vibrio cholera causes cholera, and even Lyme's disease is caused by Spirilla. Bacteria have some other structures that help them evade the immune system. These include flagella, which allow it to move, capsules, which make it very difficult for our immune system to destroy, and spores. When they have spores, they can actually sit dormant on a surface for a long period of time. The spores of the bacteria will convert back to a vegetative state when the conditions improve. So for example, if it's dry, they may dry on a surface. Once they become moist again, they can come back to life. This can make them very dangerous. Some bacteria that have spores are Clostridium tetani, botulinum, and anthracis, which is anthrax. So here's a video. I'm not going to share this as part of our lecture, but I'm going to include this underneath this lecture for you to watch on your own. These are the 5 deadliest substances on Earth. It's very interesting. A lot of them are created by bacteria. So in your free time, I highly recommend that you watch this because you will find it very interesting. Again, this will be included underneath this video.